Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I have a story for you today that you won't want to miss. So sit back, grab a drink, and let me tell you about it. In a quiet corner of rural Georgia, nestled between the Pinewood Hills and a river that shimmered like melted glass, lived a woman named Miriam. She was the kind of person people overlooked, not because she was invisible, but because she didn't demand attention. She wore her silver-streaked curls in a loose bun, favored faded denim over designer brands, and spent her mornings tending to a modest vegetable garden behind her aging farmhouse. Miriam had lived in that house her whole life. It had belonged to her grandparents, who'd built it with their own hands back in the 1940s. After losing her husband to a sudden illness in her early 40s, she found solace in the soil. There was something about pulling weeds, planting seeds, and watching life grow again that helped her heal. By 60, Miriam had become a fixture in the town, a quiet, dependable woman who sold squash and tomatoes at the farmer's market, offered help to neighbors without being asked, and knew the name of every child in the church choir. So when a man in a crisp suit knocked on her door one October afternoon, clipboard in hand and eyes cold as slate, Miriam was understandably wary. "Ma'am," he said, not even bothering to introduce himself, "I'm here on behalf of the county. It appears there's an ongoing property dispute regarding the eastern edge of your land." Miriam wiped her hands on her apron. "You mean the field behind the oak trees? That's been mine since before I was born." The man didn't flinch. "It was recently sold to a private developer. There's a claim that your garden encroaches on their land by nearly 50 feet. "What?" Miriam's voice shook slightly. "That's not possible." But within a week, she received a formal summons. The case had been fast-tracked, unusually so. Her hearing was to be held in county court in less than a month, under the jurisdiction of Judge Rayburn, a man known for his impatience and thinly veiled contempt for those he deemed lesser folk. Miriam had only seen him once, years ago, when she sat in the gallery during a zoning meeting. She remembered how he smirked when speaking to a single mother defending her right to keep a home daycare. "He likes to show off," her friend Carol said grimly over tea. "Especially when he smells weakness." Miriam wasn't rich. She wasn't connected. But what few people knew was that decades ago, in another life, she had once studied law. Not at some Ivy League school, but in night classes at a local college, back when she and her husband were still young and dreaming big. She dropped out before graduating when her father fell ill and needed care. Life had pulled her in a different direction, but the mind she'd once honed hadn't dulled. She spent the next 3 weeks digging, not just through her soil, but through decades of legal documents. Her grandfather's hand-drawn plot maps, dusty county archives, tax records that still bore faded coffee stains. Every night, long after the sun set and the wind whispered through the trees, Miriam sat beneath a lamp in her kitchen with a yellow highlighter and a cup of strong tea. On the morning of the hearing, she wore a navy cardigan and a plain skirt. No makeup, no lawyer by her side. Just a leather-bound folder of documents hugged tightly to her chest. Courtroom 2B was small, but it felt cavernous as she stepped inside. Judge Rayburn sat at the bench, his expression already bored. His gavel sat within easy reach, like a loaded pistol. Across the aisle sat the plaintiff's attorney, a sleek man in an even sleeker suit, representing Avondale Developments, the kind of faceless entity that turned wildflower fields into parking lots. "Mrs. Miriam," Judge Rayburn said, barely glancing at her file. "You're representing yourself, I see." "Yes, Your Honor." He chuckled. Actually chuckled. "Well, that should be enlightening." There were quiet laughs behind her. She didn't turn to see who they came from. As the plaintiff's attorney launched into a rehearsed monologue about progress and economic growth, Miriam kept her eyes on the judge. Not angry. Not afraid. Just steady. When it was her turn, she stood. Her voice wasn't loud. But it was clear. "Your Honor, I'd like to begin by addressing the 1954 county ordinance regarding agricultural boundary protection, as well as present 3 exhibits that directly contradict the plaintiff's land survey. The room fell oddly quiet. The judge blinked. "Excuse me," he said slowly. "I said I'd like to present my exhibits. Starting with Exhibit A, a copy of the original deed from 1947, which includes the disputed acreage. It's notarized and recorded in the county books." She stepped forward and placed the paper on the desk with careful precision. The judge reached for it. And for the first time, his smirk faltered. This can't be right," he muttered, squinting. Miriam waited. Behind her, someone whispered, "Who is this woman?" The courtroom was silent except for the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft rustle of legal papers. Judge Rayburn adjusted his glasses, a small frown forming as he reread the deed Miriam had handed him. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by women like her. In his courtroom, people like Miriam usually came to plead or apologize, not to outmaneuver corporate attorneys with words like, "Exhibit A." He cleared his throat. "Where did you obtain this deed?" "My grandfather kept it in a lockbox under the floorboards," Miriam replied. "Along with a series of notarized tax maps going back 70 years. Her voice was calm, but her heart thudded hard against her chest. She didn't let it show. "If the court permits, I'd also like to submit Exhibits B and C, property tax receipts and a zoning exception from 1986. Both confirm the original plot boundaries, including the land the plaintiff claims belongs to them." Judge Rayburn took the documents without another word, but the attorney from Avondale, his name was Clark, Miriam had learned, stood up, clearly irritated. "Your Honor, these documents are dated and incomplete. There's no way to verify." "They're certified copies from the county archives," Miriam said quickly, not missing a beat. "Page 5 of Exhibit B includes the county registrar's seal. Right next to the tax stamp." Clark opened his mouth. Then closed it. Rayburn leaned back in his chair, visibly annoyed now, but more at the situation than at Miriam. He'd expected a meek widow with a shaky voice and mismatched papers. What he got instead was a woman who had done her homework, a woman who knew the law better than some junior lawyers in the room. Still, he wasn't ready to give her credit. "Let's move forward," he said, tapping his gavel once, almost absent-mindedly. "Mr. Clark, present your client's survey again. We'll compare." The new land survey was slick, digital, printed on glossy paper. Clark handed it over with forced confidence. "This was conducted just last month by Millstone surveyors, fully licensed and compliant with state law." Rayburn skimmed it. His eyes narrowed slightly. Miriam, waiting quietly, finally spoke. "If I may point out something." Rayburn sighed. "Go ahead." She walked up to the judge's bench, stopped just short of the line, and pointed. "That survey references a cedar fence line as the eastern border. But that fence was built in 2009. I replaced it myself after a tornado flattened the original. The real boundary is 15 feet beyond that, lined with concrete property stakes my grandfather placed back in the 1940s. I dug one of them up last week. Took a photo." She pulled it from her folder and placed it neatly in front of the judge. "Dated, with GPS coordinates," she added. Rayburn looked at the image, a rusted metal stake driven into red clay, with a ruler and newspaper beside it for scale and date. Murmurs echoed across the gallery. Even Clark shifted in his seat. "You're saying," Rayburn said slowly, "that their survey is based on a false boundary?" "I'm saying," Miriam replied, "that they either didn't know or didn't care." The judge stared at her. For the first time, there was no condescension in his eyes, just calculation. "This court will take a short recess," he said finally, and struck the gavel. Outside the courtroom, the autumn wind had picked up. Miriam stood near the stone steps, her folder still clutched to her chest. Her legs ached from standing, but her mind was alert, almost electric. It had been years, decades, since she'd felt this sharp. Alive, even. Carol met her with a hot coffee in a styrofoam cup. "You're scaring people in there," she whispered, half joking. "Clark looks like he's about to pop a blood vessel." Miriam smiled softly. "Let him." They sat in silence for a few moments, watching leaves swirl across the sidewalk. "Why didn't you ever become a lawyer?" Carol asked. Miriam looked out at the trees. "Life got in the way. I took care of my father. Then my husband. Then this land. I guess I always thought there'd be time later." Carol squeezed her hand. "Well, later showed up." Back in the courtroom, things took a different tone. Judge Rayburn no longer leaned lazily on his bench. He sat upright, reading through Miriam's documents more thoroughly. Clark tried to interrupt, but his voice carried less weight now. The courtroom had shifted, subtly, but unmistakably. It wasn't just a property dispute anymore. It was something else. Something personal. Rayburn tapped his gavel again. "Mrs. Miriam, do you have any more evidence you wish to submit?" "Yes, Your Honor. One last item." She pulled out a photo, black and white, frayed edges. A family portrait taken in front of the old barn, with the very oak tree still standing in the background. Her grandfather stood tall beside a hand-painted wooden sign, "Miriam's Garden, EST 1948. "This land has fed 3 generations," she said softly. "We didn't take it. We built it. With our hands. Our time. Our hearts." For the first time, her voice wavered. Rayburn didn't look at her. He stared at the photo, longer than expected. Then, finally, he looked up. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for my ruling," he said. "Court is adjourned." The gavel echoed through the chamber, sharper this time. And as the people filed out, more than a few gave Miriam a second glance, not with pity, but with something like respect. Even Clark didn't meet her eyes. That night, Miriam sat on her porch under a blanket, the stars scattered like breadcrumbs across the velvet sky. She held the photo of her grandfather and whispered, "I hope I did you proud." Because tomorrow, everything would change. For better or worse. She had done all she could. The courthouse felt colder the next morning. The kind of chill that seeped into the bones, not from the weather, but from what was at stake. Miriam sat quietly in the second row, her leather folder on her lap like a shield. She hadn't slept much. Her mind had run through every scenario, every possible outcome. Judge Rayburn entered without ceremony. No warm-up small talk. No fake pleasantries. Just a stiff glance over his glasses as he took his seat. "Before we proceed," he said, voice clipped, "this court received a late affidavit this morning from a former county zoning officer, Michael Estes. Retired. He states that he personally certified the original boundary markers on Mrs. Miriam's property in 1991, confirming the validity of the old deed and plot map." Clark's jaw visibly clenched. Rayburn continued. "I've reviewed his testimony. I find it credible." Miriam felt her fingers tighten around the folder. She dared not react. "Not yet." However, Rayburn added, his voice darkening, "I also reviewed the plaintiff's survey. It fails to mention that the original fence line, used to claim new property boundaries, was constructed without proper permit. Which is a direct violation of County Ordinance 22B. Clark stood, clearly rattled. "Your Honor, if I may." "You may not," Rayburn snapped. The courtroom fell deathly silent. Clark sat down. Then Rayburn turned, slowly, deliberately, to face Miriam. "This court acknowledges the legitimacy of Mrs. Miriam's claim to the disputed land and finds that Avondale Developments acted in bad faith by submitting a misleading property survey." There was a collective inhale in the room. "Therefore," he said, voice resolute, "the plaintiff's motion to seize the land is hereby denied. All property rights remain with the defendant. Furthermore, the court refers the matter of survey misconduct to the County Ethics Committee for investigation." The gavel struck with finality. It was over. Miriam closed her eyes for just a moment. Just long enough to feel the weight lift. When she opened them again, Carol had her hand on her shoulder, tears shining in her eyes. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." But Miriam couldn't speak. Not yet. Her throat was too tight with emotion. It wasn't just the legal victory. It was something deeper, something that had lived inside her since the day her husband died, and she started to believe that she had somehow missed her moment in life. That it was too late to be more than what the world expected of her. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, something Miriam never would have imagined. Apparently, someone from the gallery had posted a short clip online of her cross-referencing tax maps and correcting Clark mid-sentence. The video had gone viral overnight. "Farm widow shuts down sleazy developers in courtroom showdown," one headline read. "Miriam, do you have a comment?" a young reporter asked, thrusting a mic toward her. She blinked at the cameras. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a politician. I'm just someone who pays attention." The crowd laughed softly. Then her tone turned gentle. "You don't have to wear a suit to know the truth. You just have to care enough to look for it." It wasn't flashy. But it was real. And for the first time, people were listening. Later that evening, as dusk fell and golden light spilled across her garden rows, Miriam knelt in the dirt. She pressed her palm to the earth, her earth, and felt it steady beneath her. It wasn't just a legal line on a map. It was the sum of her life, her legacy, her love. Every tomato vine, every bean sprout, every weed she ever pulled told a part of her story. She heard the crunch of gravel behind her. "You're becoming a bit of a local legend," came a familiar voice. It was Deputy Walter, the gentle-natured man who had delivered her summons weeks ago. "I saw the whole thing online," he said, smiling. "Even my daughter texted me about you. Called you a badass." Miriam laughed, wiping her hands on her apron. "Tell her I'm more barefoot in the garden than badass, but I'll take the compliment." Walter's smile softened. "We could use more people like you, Miriam. People who stand up." She nodded, and for a moment, they just stood together in the quiet. Then Walter reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document. "This came down from the county office. Final confirmation of your title, with the court ruling attached. Thought I'd bring it by myself." Miriam took it, her hands trembling just slightly. She didn't need the paper to know what was hers, but somehow, it made everything feel real. She looked out across her land, the garden, the trees, the old barn in the distance, and for the first time in a very long while, she didn't feel small. She felt seen. Not because she had shouted. Not because she had demanded. But because she had refused to let anyone erase her. By the following week, Miriam's life had changed in ways she never could have predicted. It started with the mailbox. Tucked between the usual seed catalogs and water bills were envelopes, handwritten, postmarked from as far away as Oregon, Michigan, and Vermont. Some were thick with folded letters, others thin with single pages, each one carrying a story. People writing to thank her. People telling her she gave them courage. A widower from Montana who was fighting a similar land battle. A single mother in Tennessee who said, "You made me believe it's not too late to start over." One envelope contained nothing but a Polaroid of a backyard garden, captioned in blue ink, "For Miriam, you inspired me to plant again." At first, she thought it was some fluke of internet fame, that it would blow over like a summer storm. But it didn't. More came. Emails. Messages through Carol's nephew, who helped set up a simple website for her after local news ran a follow-up story titled, "The Woman Who Faced Down a Judge and Won." Miriam couldn't help but smile at that one. She hadn't set out to face down anyone. She had just told the truth and refused to be bulldozed. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized how many people had been quietly bulldozed for years, by power, money, noise, and titles. That, she figured, was why her story had stuck. Spring came early that year. The garden erupted with life like it was celebrating with her, rows of bright peas, green onions, sun-warmed strawberries, and the first blush of heirloom tomatoes. Children came from the nearby school to help plant. Miriam started teaching weekend workshops about composting, soil health, and how to keep deer out without chemicals. But the biggest surprise came one April afternoon, when she received a letter from the dean of the small law college she'd once attended decades ago. It was printed on thick paper and signed in pen. Ms. Miriam. It has come to our attention that you demonstrated extraordinary legal literacy, composure, and clarity in your recent court appearance. Though you never completed your degree, your contribution to community justice is nothing short of inspirational. We would be honored to offer you a scholarship to complete your studies, at your pace, on your terms. The world needs more minds, and hearts, like yours. She stared at the letter for a long time. At 61, Miriam had believed the world no longer wanted her ambition. She thought maybe that part of her, the sharp, curious girl who had once memorized case law by candlelight, had faded into memory. But now, as she sat on her porch holding that letter, she realized she didn't feel old. She felt ready. Later that night, she opened her grandmother's old Bible and tucked the scholarship letter between the pages. Right next to a pressed wildflower and a note she had written years ago after burying her husband. One day, you'll do more than survive. You'll bloom. News spread that Judge Rayburn had taken a sudden leave of absence. Some said it was pressure from the ethics investigation. Others whispered he'd been rattled, really rattled, by being outwitted on his own turf. Whatever the reason, he didn't return to the bench that spring. The courtroom felt different without him. Lighter. Fairer. There were rumors a young judge, compassionate and meticulous, would take his place. One afternoon in May, as Miriam returned from a garden co-op meeting, she found a letter on her porch with no return address. Inside was a single note in precise, slanted handwriting. You reminded me that the law is meant to serve people, not power. I hope someday I'll live up to what the robe should stand for. R. She read it twice, then folded it gently and slid it into her desk drawer, right beside her court documents. She didn't hate him. Not anymore. She just hoped he changed. On the one-year anniversary of the case, a local filmmaker interviewed Miriam for a community project. The camera sat perched on a tripod, and she sat in a rocking chair on the porch, her dog curled at her feet. The interviewer asked, if you could say one thing to women who feel small, forgotten, or powerless, what would it be? Miriam thought for a long time before answering. I'd say, you're not powerless just because you're quiet. You're not weak because you don't yell. You don't need to be famous to matter. You just need to know your truth and hold the line. She looked out over her garden. Even if the world tries to move the fence on you. That summer, Miriam enrolled in one evening course. Then another. She studied contracts and torts and brushed up on constitutional law. She'd never become a courtroom litigator, she didn't want to. But she was working toward her certification in community advocacy. Her dream now wasn't to argue, but to equip, to help others like her, who might not know what rights they had until someone showed them how to read between the lines. The land remained hers. But the impact spread far beyond her fence line. Everywhere she went, people asked about her story. They wanted her opinion on school zoning, local policy, housing ordinances. She gave it freely, humbly. And slowly, something shifted in the town. People began asking more questions. Showing up to meetings. Holding their heads a little higher. And it all began with a woman the judge had once tried to embarrass. But instead of crumbling, she had stood her ground. Quietly. Bravely. Brilliantly.